Get in on the action and make your bet with Sports Interaction. With competitive odds, the best live in play, and more ways to get into the game. Make your next bet with Sports Interaction. Head to sportsinteraction.com/SDPN or download the app to get started. 19 plus. Please play responsibly. Mike Babcock, the now no longer the Columbus Blue Jackets head coach, he has resigned. The tenure with the Blue Jackets lasting just under 2 months. This comes less than a week after allegations surface about him taking players' photos, putting them up on the big screen TV in his coaching office. Those allegations were surfaced through the Spit and Chicklets podcast by Paul Bissonnette, and now we are here. CJ, how did we get here? Let's talk about how we got to this point where Mike Babcock no longer has a job.
Well, let me start by saying there's a lot of people right now that are surprised that we're here. I think that, clearly to make the kind of hiring the Blue Jackets did in July, to put their faith in Mike Babcock, and for him not even to see the end of the prospects tournament, not even, ever lead the team in a practice or open a training camp or coach a game. I mean, this is a highly unusual set of circumstances. And I think it's important for us to focus on the facts. And admittedly, we do not have all the facts in this circumstance. I mean, we know that the NHL Players Association met with players in Columbus. They shared those findings with the league. We talked about that late last week. But, it does sound as though there was one player in particular that brought forward some concerns about his dealings with Mike Babcock. But ultimately, this is a resignation. This is something where Mike Babcock and Blue Jackets management had a lot of conversations, leading up to figuring out what they're going to do. And they decide to go their separate ways, without knowing the extent of the allegations, what happened. I think that there's a lot of people drawing a lot of conclusions. One thing that my mind goes to, though, in this case is that it just got to a point where it was going to be impossible for him to go in that dressing room with any credibility, for him to lead the team. I think that from the organization standpoint, I mean, you don't get to this point where you're negotiating an exit with a head coach before he's even coached a game very lightly, right? I mean, this is a sign of something that's gone totally wrong. And so, it was a strange story. If you remember initially, Julian, after the initial allegations on Spit and Chicklets were about an interaction with Boone Jenner, the Jackets captain. I mean, that fire, if you want to call it, was put out within 6 hours because Boone Jenner came forward and said that, yes, he had a meeting with Mike Babcock, but he had no issue with what went on in that meeting. But clearly that doesn't mean that there weren't other issues with some of his teammates, or at least with one of his teammates. And ultimately, I think that everyone looked at this, likely Mike Babcock included. I mean, reading between the lines of the statement he put out on Sunday night as part of this announcement, you almost get the sense, he doesn't need this at this point, that the organization decided they don't need this. And, there's a lot, I think, that we can kind of zoom in on, because I think there's a lot of moving parts to this story. As much as it started with one specific allegation, it ends up where, the Blue Jackets, quite frankly, were looking to bring in a veteran head coach to push themselves up the standings. And so to wind up a couple days before training camp having this happen, I mean, this is a disaster on a number of fronts.
Let me read the statement Mike Babcock put out through the team. Upon reflection, it has become clear that continuing as head coach of the Columbus Blue Jackets was going to be too much of a distraction. While I'm disappointed to have not had the opportunity to continue the work we've begun, I know it's in the best interest of the organization for me to step away at this time. I wish everyone in the organization well in the upcoming season. When we talked about this topic last, I had brought up the fact that, okay, there were some players who said it wasn't a big deal. And in my mind, I had not heard, okay, this player say this wasn't comfortable. This player said it wasn't comfortable. Clearly, in the last few days, enough players spoke to the NHLPA and made those feelings heard in this case. I'm curious if it was younger players. I'm curious what other players in that locker room just said, hey, this isn't a good look. I don't like this. I don't feel comfortable. I know we don't have all the facts. I'm just curious. My mind immediately goes to that point of this entire story. I wonder who eventually expressed just concerns about all of that.
Well, it does sound like it was a younger player, at least one, that had some concerns or issues, or was uncomfortable with dealing with Mike Babcock, as opposed to some of the veterans, right? I mean, we heard Johnny Gaudreau address this to some of our colleagues that were at the NHL Media Tour in Vegas. We had the Boone Jenner statement. It doesn't seem as though this was driven by the sort of more veteran players, we'll call it, inside that Blue Jackets dressing room. I think it was, maybe players that haven't quite arrived to the NHL or in the earlier stages that brought forward some issues here. But I think it's kind of noteworthy if we go over the timeline of events that, the organization went to a prospect tournament in Traverse City, Michigan, a couple days after the initial reports or allegations surfaced. They brought Mike Babcock with them. He was seen at the first game there that the team played. I think where this started to gain a little bit more speculation or heat is, they played games, on Saturday and Sunday in which, the reporters in the building, said that Mike Babcock wasn't among those that were in attendance all of a sudden with this sort of Blue Jackets crew. But I mean, they were operating as recently as the start of this weekend as though he was still their head coach, right? And so, it's I think that ultimately, if you're in the spot the Blue Jackets are as an organization, if you even have a question, if you have one question in your mind about whether, you could send Mike Babcock in as your head coach and still expect him to get the results that you hired him to get, and you're at this stage, right? I mean, they have Adam Fantilli. He actually scored a hat trick in one of the prospect games that were played in Traverse City over the weekend. But number 2 overall draft pick, obviously a very important player for this organization. They hope for the next 15 years. I mean, they have other prospects because they have been a team in recent years at the bottom of the standings. This is going to probably be a younger-ish roster, given where they're at in their cycle. And so, I think that all that factors in to some degree. But, it's a hard one for us to – I want to be very careful here because, this is a very sensitive story. And because of that sensitivity, I can tell you quite frankly, there's not a lot of people saying too much about it. The principles involved here, we have this statement from the Blue Jackets, but are really not. This isn't like a trade where, there's a lot of people maybe giving you background on the side. I think everyone's very careful in this point. And, so it's hard to have a full picture into what happened beyond, I think, what did become clear, though, probably on both sides, quite honestly, is that this just was an untenable situation, where it got to. I mean, it was a couple days of open speculation with Mike Babcock, of thinking of the things he's done, of, reflecting on or discussing some of what's happened in the past. And, you go back to the original sin here, right? The original sin, I would argue, was hiring him. And, someone might sit here and say, well, that's, it's easy with the benefit of hindsight. I mean, I think that there was enough people, myself included, that made that observation, back in June when it first surfaced that he was going to be their head coach, and that there was a lot of risk with that call, that decision, at a really important time for this organization, I should add too. I mean, with them, having bottomed out and trying to work their way back into, a spot where they'll be a playoff team and what they hope eventually will be a championship caliber team. I mean, this was an important hire, and it feels like it didn't really have much of a chance from the beginning, I think, because of some of Mike Babcock's past and what we learned about the Blue Jackets here, right? They didn't really have his back ultimately. I'm not arguing they should have, but clearly there's, before they've even seen him coach a practice or all the things I mentioned earlier, they've got to a point where they wanted to move on from him as well. This was a mutual decision. And so I think that kind of underlines that this really was a mistake from the beginning. And I don't think it ever had any chance to succeed, quite honestly. I think that it was the wrong hire and the wrong thing. And, it lasted 78 days when all was said and done.
This lasted shorter, and I get that I'm making this analogy and people are going to look at it as a joke, but this lasted longer. No, this was shorter than the supposedly Kim Kardashian, Chris Humphries marriage or whatever. And I'm not just bringing this up to make a joke here. This is just a ridiculous situation. If you're going to get to this point where you realize, as you said, CJ, it's not worth having this person's back, what was the point of hiring him in the first place? We have discussed Mike Babcock on this podcast and how he might not have done the work to warrant getting a second chance. Why would Columbus think this person was worth going through all of this trouble for? And then to have it blow up in their face spectacularly before training camp starts. The Columbus Blue Jackets should have egg on their face for this. And then you have a whole statement that goes out where, hey, maybe it was fine for Boone Jenner and for Mike Babcock between those two. But clearly, there were players in that organization who were not a fan of that particular situation, and they felt uncomfortable, and it's led to this. It's embarrassing for this organization. I know we'll talk more about Jarmo Kekalainen and what could be next for him later on in the show. But right now, if you're the Columbus Blue Jackets, if you're John Davidson, if you're everyone in that organization, you should feel embarrassed that the fact that it has come to this situation. Mike Babcock was clearly not worth the risk, and it has blown up spectacularly in their face. It's embarrassing for the organization as far as I'm concerned.
Well, all I can really do is point you to the comments from Jarmo Kekalainen, the general manager, when they hired Mike Babcock. I mean, it seemed clear in what he told reporters that day that he was comfortable that Mike had, reflected properly on his previous, times in the NHL, that he had done the work, to borrow your phrase, that he was ready to lead the team forward. And yet here he really hasn't had a chance to lead the team. I mean, obviously over these ensuing months, there's been an opportunity for him to meet with players. This is where the original allegations come from, and start those conversations in that process. But never even got a chance to coach the team. I mean, it is embarrassing. I don't think there's any other way to put it if you're looking at this from the Blue Jackets side of things. And they felt he was ready, that he deserved the chance, that he had earned another contract. And obviously, when you say why did they get to that point, I mean, we're not in that decision, but I think it's fair to assume that Mike Babcock's resume of winning was a huge driving force for this. I mean, he's someone, for better or for worse. I mean, his track record speaks for itself, and he's dragged a lot out of his teams. And I think that they felt, especially after last season, that things went so wrong there in Columbus. It was basically a lost year for the organization. They needed someone to push some buttons, but it's a big mistake. And the irony of it all, maybe they end up with the right coach in the end. I mean, Pascal Vincent, who's going to take over as the head coach now, who has been the associate coach in Columbus for a couple of years already, is he's not young per se, early 50s, but this is his first chance as an NHL head coach, and is seen kind of as someone who I think he's had sort of a hype around him, a small hype around him the last couple of years, that he could be a good NHL head coach. And strange as these things work out, maybe they with the wrong process, end up where they should have been to begin with.